Good morning. My name is Michael Darden. I am with DFM Data Corp. Very happy to be here today to be able to give a little discussion at this blockchain conference related to supply chain. One of the most sought after use cases for the use of blockchain. Next slide, please. So my background mostly spans the East Coast United States from being born in Long Island, New York originally, and moving down to Georgia and back into Florida and then to Virginia, and I've been around the East Coast and moved up and down to long places. Lots of different addresses during the time that you have moves throughout your life, but those addresses are postal addresses. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of addresses as we go through the presentation. Next slide. I do have a background with some intellectual property related to dynamic and predictive information processing systems and methods for transportation assets. A little bit of a mouthful, but this is like the precursor to Uber back in 2003, 2004. I had finished working with the Olympics in 1995 and had an opportunity to be able to kind of see how dispatching of loads and matching of capacity to loads was a very dynamic process, and that the influence of handheld devices and computer systems was going to be influential as opposed to replacing the phone call and the fax machine. And the phone call and the fax machine moved information around, not in a very tangible way, but this patent was actually split into two different patents. It was originally filed as 79 claims and then divided into two patents, one with 37 claims and one with 42 claims. Next slide, please. So currently I operate under two different companies. One is called Block Know-How. Block Know-How was formed in 2018 related to mostly IBM's Hyperledger influence, where the objective was to look for a hybrid sort of blockchain that would fit commercial environments. There were the confusion back in 2018 around what is Bitcoin and what is blockchain, and are they the same thing? And it did take some time for people to be able to convert in the marketplace. I was part of an organization initially called Blockchain Chamber of Commerce back in 2018, along with this effort of Block Know-How. And currently Block Know-How is operated with a team of industrial designers that put together training material and coursework for certification and credentialing and micro-credentialing for different skill sets. The DFM Data Corporation is actually the one that I focus most of my time and interest on. DFM Data was formed in 2019. We have worked with several standards bodies, specifically the International Standards Organization, GBBC, which is the Global Blockchain Business Council, which we're proudly a member of for several years as different classes of members within GBBC. Additionally, I was introduced to an organization called ASTM back in 2022. ASTM is a 127-year-old organization related to standards development. And when we're looking at interoperability and interconnectivity of the supply chain and shrinking that time frame from interest of getting something moved to executing that transaction and the digital information that's related to that, that's where blockchain kind of fits into this equation. It's always been seen as the super use case for supply chain to be adopted in blockchain, or excuse me, in supply chain for blockchain or blockchain for supply chain. But there's some challenges that are involved in adopting blockchain for supply chain or supply chain for blockchain. Next slide, please. In 2025, I was introduced to Hedera and their council, where they have a governance structure, very well-balanced structure of being able to facilitate transaction processing for very small transaction value, but or cost, but a tremendous amount of value for being able to process a high volume number of transactions at a very small cost. The Hedera Council has recently added FedEx's own Dale Christie. Dale will be presenting, I think, as the closing presentation for today. But Dale and I were presenting just a couple of weeks ago at another event that's in the lower right-hand corner. But in the upper right-hand corner, if you guys can click on that video, it is actually a play video, and see if it'll play with the audio for me. The one in the upper right, please. Just like the first minute and a half.
Good afternoon. Just when you thought it wasn't going to get any more exciting, we're going to talk about supply chains. Woo-hoo. I'm honored to be here today. I'm a proud member of GBBC through BITA Standards Council. FedEx, UPS, and others are founding members of the Standards Council going back to 2017. We're focused on open, harmonized, interoperable movement standards for supply chains. Again, you're hearing a lot of the same types of things, interoperability and harmonization, various things like that. You're going to hear more in this case as well. We see it going in the same direction from that point of view. What I'm going to talk about today is the current GSMI 5.0 supply chain paper, which we published not quite a year ago. FedEx and UPS were co-leads of that. And we really had the opportunity for the first time to talk about what the future of global supply chains looks like. Most people really didn't care much about supply chains until the pandemic, when they couldn't get paper towels and other things off the shelf. And then all of a sudden they became very interested. Why can't I get this? Why is this inconveniencing me? And I've got, a 42-hour seminar to walk you through that if you really are interested in that. But we're going to start basically by kind of going backwards. So kind of a back to the future approach, if you will. In order to look at the future, we had to look at what got us here. And the fact is, we have thousands of years of supply chains and customs and all kinds of things that go back to clay tablets and papyrus and paper, and they've led us to this point. So there's a lot of value in connecting those dots, not only in a rear view mirror, but also looking to the windshield, which gets us to the D word, digital. And so this is one of the most beautiful things you're ever going to see today. I've got about 9 minutes left, so we're going to go deeply into all 70 of these international standards developments entities. This is, I think...
Stop it there. So if you'll go to the next slide, what Dale's actually showing here is what I refer to as the onion. And the onion, can you go to the next slide, please? Go one more forward. So I feel like we missed a slide. It looks like a rainbow. So I don't see it, sorry about that. So the onion is what Dale was showing. It's a landscape of all of the different standards bodies that are across. It may be in the appendix of the deck. I don't know if you can see a slider there, sorry for the delay on it, but the onion, what I was trying, it didn't come across very well on the graphic in Dale's video, but the onion describes, so if you can just forward through to the last slide, the very end, keep going. I'm going to ask you to fold back if you would, but near the end, there's a thing that looks like a, there you go back right there. That's the onion. The onion is made up of those 3-letter acronyms that make up the different standards bodies around the world that are trying to be able to solve supply chain problems. It's a little bit of a complex landscape of historical organizations that are trying to be able to figure out how to be able to write the rules and the guardrails for standardization. And this has been a slow-moving train wreck for a long time of watching this emerge. AI is pouring gasoline on this. The need for being able to have guardrails and defining rules for structuring information and structuring data is being looked at for the standards bodies. Is how is this data formatted? How should it be structured? How should it be? And in the void of standards, developers just use what's most convenient for them to be able to do, or some proprietary methodology for being able to store or put data in their own database. And Interoperability is kind of the key word that everybody wants to be able to talk through in the supply chain world. And interoperability kind of leads to an insight of being able to share information and get value from that information to generate decisions from that information. And that self-determination of decision-making is what kind of triggers it to go from interconnectivity to interoperability. And there's a real distinction between interconnectivity and interoperability that I don't think has been made clear enough. Right now, there's about 14 different dictionary definitions for the term interoperability that are used around the world. And it's so overly used that it doesn't have any real meaning to it anymore. It becomes so ubiquitous in how it can be defined that it creates trouble in how different people understand the term. The Federal Maritime Commission actually, can you go backwards for me? Yeah, that one, that's fine. You can go forward one. So back to where the onion was, right there. So this slide shows kind of the vastness of the landscape related to supply chain. The left side of the screen is those three-letter agencies related to the government that are attempting to be able to provide regulation, oversight for how supply chains will have interoperability or interconnectivity or rules for being able to engage in commercial transactions. There is a little bit of a debate that was out about a year ago related to harmonizing the financial transactions between different areas of the government, where a joint technical committee was formed to be able to try to identify what should we do for the Paperwork Reduction Act to make it so that regular society civilians can submit their information in a format and have that format workable across different areas of the government. When the government put together their call for papers on this, they requested numerous agencies to be able to participate, but they didn't invite any of the transportation companies, any of the transportation-related agencies. It was like they didn't recognize them as transportation transactions, where there is actually a buyer, there is actually a seller, and there is a settlement that needs to take place between the parties. The knowing who the stakeholders are is oftentimes left between agencies on the right-hand side of this slide, the ones who end up being marketplaces or service providers trying to make a connection between one company doing a function and one company doing a service to support that function. But making that match oftentimes is challenging because of the fact that one company may apply to a GS1 standard and one company may align with a UNCFAC standard. Just because they align to a standard doesn't make them interoperable or interconnected. So there's a long way to go in the standards world. Thinking from that onion perspective, they don't work with each other very effectively. They haven't worked with each other historically very effectively. And there is a move afoot to be able to enable these standards bodies to work more closely together. So if my slide operator can kind of go back to the beginning portion of the presentation where we were. This is good. Our effort to be able to try to help these standards bodies that are scattered all across the supply chain areas, some of them on digital IDs, some of them on statuses, some of them on markings and labels and sizes, but they're all in different areas. And in order to be able to stitch together what your proper standard solution is, we really don't have a common denominator. And the research paper was written about 5 years ago as a white paper to be able to say, with all these digital freight matching marketplaces, how could we deduplicate those marketplaces and make them so that they have less friction? And the research was done at several different high-level PhD folks to be able to read into it and recognize that there are some common elements on every transaction that takes place. There is a time and date that it is first available to move. There is an origin of where those goods are before they move. There is a destination of where they need to be delivered to be considered complete. There is someone who owns that transaction as far as getting paid for it, and there is some reference number that is necessary to be able to reference in order to process that transaction. Whether that's a postcard, or whether it's an envelope, or whether it's a box, or whether it's a pallet, or whether it's a truckload, you have the same pieces of information that are available on every transaction. And what I realized when I started looking at this problem was that each of these elements had already been turned into a standard before. There was already a standard called ISO 8601 for date and time that is the international standard for how to represent when and where, or when, location, as well as the time zone that it's located in. The GPS location is kind of good enough, and people know what a GPS location is, but a GPS location is on the surface of the planet. And as transportation moves and changes, your DoorDash may come to your apartment on the 4th floor of a building, and a drone may come to deliver that. It's not going to be able to deliver just to the mailbox in the bottom floor. It needs to be able to consume altitude as well. There is a standard called ISO 8000-118, which is the natural location identifier that takes that longitude and latitude information and converts it using a shortening mechanism of hashing to be able to produce a globally unique but reproducible identifier for the longitude, latitude, and altitude of where a destination or an origin is. So you could consider a drone pickup to a drone delivery as being an exact point to point using the same methodology. The who owns the transaction is probably the most tricky part of this. There are lots of registries to be able to identify who you are. The Secretary of State is kind of the starting point of that registry. When you form your company, you go to the Secretary of State and register your company as being the owner, and that entity gets a born-on date, and it will live until it no longer lives. But that entity identifier really just gets an update once a year when you re-register with the Secretary of State and pay your small fee to be able to keep it so that it's active. There are shorter term identifiers that can be referenced through APIs in a more real-time need, transactional base, to be able to validate that there's nothing that's changed on that identifier. But in today's world, this background check doesn't get done very effectively. In the trucking and logistics world, this is worked off of a phone call and a, hey, I got a load to move from St. Louis to Atlanta, can you help me out? Turning that into something that is formed digitally and meaningfully is a strategy that would allow for us to achieve interconnectivity without interoperability. And it's important that we're not striving to achieve interoperability because, frankly, that's where fraud is entering this marketplace, where shippers are hiring a broker is bringing a carrier, the carrier is noting what the operation is, and they're sending one of their friends to be able to bring a load later, a truck later to be able to pick up a load. It's 100 different types of fraud on 37 different threat vectors that have been identified as this transaction for shipments to capacity is being facilitated through phone calls and emails and what used to be fax machines. There's a lot of technology that's come in to be able to read those transactions, and when they read it, it reads the whole page. And when it reads the whole page, it's not just looking at what the origin is and the destination, it's also grabbing who it's going to, how much they paid for it, what the item is, what the SKU is, what the purchase order number is, it's a lot of confidential information from that entire page that is being ingested, as opposed to the traditional approach of just having manually key in those 5 fields that make up that transport unit identifier. The transport unit identifier is added a suffix. Next slide for me, please. The next point behind the transport unit identifier is calling a thing and recognizing that that thing is globally unique and it is starting here and is going here for a time certain period of movements, is the starting point of being able to plan a transaction. It's not moved yet. There is a known need from something to move from one place to another, and its plan is to be able to say, what's the itinerary? Who are the stakeholders that I need to get in touch with to be able to facilitate this transaction taking place? And that planning phase leads to an execution phase. The execution phase is when the goods are actually moving. Some party has taken possession of those goods to be able to move them from their planning phase and from their booked phase of what was planned to be able to turn into a reconciliation phase. And you'll notice that each of these phases that are on the transaction has a 3-digit code that is associated with it. They're called milestone statuses. These milestone statuses take place naturally on each transaction. So if I were here in DC and needing to be able to ship a package back to Atlanta, that movement has an origin of here, today, now, a destination of Atlanta where I want it to go to. I'm the owner of that, and my reference number is Michael123, trip to Maryland. Any transaction can have these elements assembled, but without knowing the status consistently of what it's going through, you end up with still a void between that thing and what it's doing. So the connection of these two standards, next slide for me, please. The connection of these two standards from two different standards development organizations allows us to use existing standards to identify the thing that's moving as precisely as you can possibly identify it, as simply as you can identify it, with the date and time, origin, destination that it's going to, who owns it, and what the transaction number is. And then appended to the right of that information is the status. Now, there is more information that can be appended to the right of that, and all of this information can be stored into a QR code that allows for these status changes and the history to be able to be interconnected, but not interoperable. The interoperability takes place between the stakeholders to be able to provide that extra level of information between the stakeholders in their inherent systems. We don't need to move that through the intermediary system of what is the identifier, who's the party that moved that identifier, and what status did they just certify that it's in. That's the place that my company has positioned itself to be able to serve, is as the clearinghouse of that identifier and status change between the hundreds of marketplaces that are currently making the margin between what they can find a carrier for and what they can sell that carrier's capacity to the shipper for. The carrier is getting the least amount of money on the transaction, the broker is making the most amount of money on the transaction, and the shipper is paying for a service level that is beyond what they're truly getting. So the transparency that is able to be achieved in a identifier that is going through these statuses makes it so that it is repeatable. It is a recipe that demonstrates what compliance was supposed to look like from the planning phase to what compliance looks like in the execution phase. So here's just a little example. Transactions are not quite as simple as, oh, just pick it up from here and move it to here. Let's say there's some goods that come into the port on the West Coast. They get drayed to a rail terminal, and that rail terminal is then going to take the majority of that movement across the United States. That movement, it generates a new bill of lading, and now you've got two different transactions that are still under the primary transaction of being able to move from the origin of where it came into the port to the destination of where it's going to. This transaction has been subdivided already into 3 different pieces. The next move brings it into Atlanta, where again there's another crossover from one rail to another rail. Then from that rail there's still a truck move at the end to be able to get to the customer. Normally this is invisible to people. They're not looking at how did it get there, just that it's en route to be able to get from origin to destination. Next slide. Upon receipt in the warehouse, you can go to the next slide. There's a truck move to be able to bring it to Raleigh for the final delivery, which brings it from that overarching A point to B. Everybody says the delivery is just moving it from A to B. This is actually A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E, to be able to produce the entire A to B movement, what was anticipated by the customer. If you go to the next slide for me, this is what's known as a nested TUID. And from a technical perspective, from a blockchain perspective, this is basically the way that a blockchain works, where there is a block that can be subdivided into sub-blocks that are underneath that block, identified and referencing back to the parent block to be able to maintain the chain of custody. This can be done multiple layers deep, but happens on most transactions where it's done throughout the movements of goods, either domestically or internationally, as is displayed on this picture here. Next slide. So I showed this one before when I kind of jumped forward. This is a $3 trillion a year industry, just to kind of give you an idea. Transportation in the United States is all about moving goods. We have an infrastructure of rail and roads and highway that just celebrated on the highway side 70 years of interstate travel. And there was some interesting stories that came up from that, like the very first time Roosevelt tried to be able to go from Washington to the West Coast, it took 61 days. 61 days to traverse to the West Coast. And he was like, we need a highway system. Just for interest, all major interstate systems that end in a 0 run east to west. All major interstate systems that end in a odd number run north to south. There is a natural grid that is produced, across the United States for where geolocations are because of how the highways cross each other. It's not straight lines, but it is an interesting naming of how they orderly put together the names of the roads or the numbers for the highways. Next slide. Yup, so this one we talked about before, and it hopefully is a little bit more clear to you now of the complexity that's involved. There are some layers that are involved in this as far as the governmental side on the very top of it, going down to the industry side. And here in the domestic United States, we typically look for commercial environments to be able to solve problems for us when there's a need for something to be able to take place. This $3 trillion industry that has been out on its own to be able to go do this for the past 40 years in a deregulated manner needs a little more of a public-private partnership. It has infrastructure that's owned by commercial companies, but those commercial companies need the guardrails of what the ways are to operate with people that you haven't done business with before, because it's just a normal process of doing business, is that there's going to be people that have the closest available driver, tractor, and trailer, and without being able to identify who that customer is or who that prospect is or who that service provider is and verify their capabilities and their licensing in real time and their performance capabilities, we introduce fraud in a huge way. And this has made it all over the news. And initially, I thought, this was just coming out in the transportation world and that they were zeroing in on the FinCEN and who owns the trucking companies and looking to be able to eliminate. We've now got a federal program that the vice president is running on anti-fraud, and they're looking for fraud in all different areas of organized crime, and this is one of those areas that I think is on the horizon for the different areas of the government to be able to work on. And there is legislation that is currently underway with the Genius Act and with the Clarity Act that's related to providing some certainty of what is to be expected in the use of stable coins and use of information in the digital blockchain environment. But in the world of transportation, everything has moved on a paper bill of lading since the 1400s. And that paper bill of lading follows that shipment all the way through where it's moving until it actually is sent in an envelope back to the party to be able to be entered as an invoice. And it's a real piece of paper, and it's been signed and has notes on it from 15 different people that have touched it along the way. About 3 years ago, the law was changed to be able to enable an electronic bill of lading to take place, where you can have a party who agrees to make a bill of lading that's equivalent to what the bill of lading is today, but in an electronic version. And it's taken some time, but there's now 10 companies that are working with an electronic bill of lading platform, and 5 of those platforms have become interoperable as of about a week ago. They've processed their first transactions that are cross-platform. One company working with one provider, one company working with the other provider, bill of lading being electrified at the origin, coming through the ocean way to be able to get to the destination with another provider. They haven't been able to do that until very recently because they didn't have standards. DCSA, the Digital Container Shipping Association, is made up of 12 of the largest vessel operators and about 7 years ago, they formed to be able to try to write the standards of how ports are going to move container and vessels from one port to another. They're not a standards development organization per se. Standards development organizations get an acronym called an SDO, where they follow the World Trade Organization 6 principles of standards development, and it has to do with building consensus and getting buy-in from the different stakeholders and involvement from anybody who has a voice in developing those standards. Industry standards can be developed when there are market powers that come together and say, this is the way we're going to operate, and they agree that this is the way that they're going to operate, and if they have enough market power, they can become the de facto standard. And a de facto standard oftentimes gets referenced by standards development organizations. If industry has already adopted the standards to be able to take place from a de facto standards perspective, standards bodies don't like to recreate work that's already been done. So good work that's done in industry associations really have a pathway to land with one of these companies to become a standard in an official standards development organization, but it's a maturing process. Typically, companies that wrote the standard and say, we want to write the standard, they don't want to maintain the standard. Maintaining a standard, updating what was the schedule for balloting and updates from other people that are your competitors, that's not a fun portion of standards management to be able to do. So oftentimes those de facto standards that develop in an industry that make it into standards development organizations become managed by those standards development organizations throughout the maturing of their lifespan. So typically the standards bodies that people are most familiar with is ISO and ASTM. ISO is the International Organization of Standardization. I think it's about 85 years old. ASTM is here in the United States, 127 years old. They're kind of the two oldest ones that are in the ecosystem of standards development. The CCP is taking a heavy interest in standards. They have actually trained 60,000 people to become professional standards development writers, where they're taking basically the International Standards Organization book of standards and rewriting them into the CCP rulebook of standards. So something for us to watch out for, something for the rest of the world to watch out for. Standards are meant to be able to make the world work better, not to be able to feed all the information into one body that wants to be able to use it for nefarious purposes. I don't know how many more slides are left, and I don't have a timer. Keith, how much time do I have left? 10:11. About 19 minutes. Next slide for me, please. All right, so there is some challenges with working with AI. In this slide, we categorize them as being ethics. Ethics are kind of human things that are applied here to a process. And in technology development, and as being an engineer, you typically you wear a ring when you get your engineering degree that identifies that you won't do any harm. Kind of like a doctor who doesn't want to be able to bring bad medicine to people that need help. Engineers are supposed to pay attention to the user community that are using those information. This young lady here named Mariah Hay was introduced to me at a conference in Savannah, Georgia, and this is actually several years old for this video, but many companies have stepped into the space of technology to make money and not look at the user who is going to be using this, if there is a ethical development trajectory for the use and deployment of this technology. Miss Mariah Hay, did a webinar. It's about 20 minutes long with Bill Stankiewicz and Michael Moore, who has actually since passed. But Bill Stankiewicz has led our TUID working group for the past several years and put this YouTube video together. And you can't see the link on the bottom, but it's just youtube.com/watch for the rest of it that you can see, but the sign is in front of it at the moment. So ethics are really important to be able to apply to your adoption of AI. It doesn't have that ethics clue on its own. So standards are really the way that we think that's going to move forward, where there's kind of a sliding scale of things that you might want to be able to achieve, and giving the AI some prompts to be able to be within the frame of the response that you're looking for is part of the future. I will share that on the left side of this screen, there is a dark black bolded item. It's about some current news that's happening in the standards world, where at the end of this month, standards bodies from ISO, ASTM, and 200 other smaller group industry-specific standards development organizations will be meeting at the ANSI meeting in Denver, Colorado. They've titled their presentation as Legal Issues Forum Standards at a Crossroad. And the reason for their recognition of this standards at a crossroad is because of the AI policy and practice and use of guardrails, and of standards bodies traditionally selling their standards through licensing agreements. And if you have a copyrighted standard that is available to be purchased for license, and AI gets that ingested by a user to be able to say, give me a summary of this standard, your copyright is no longer sitting in good standing. Your copyright has now been ingested by an AI engine, and it's concerning for the standards bodies that have spent 125 years developing their copyrighted materials to be able to know that any user uploading that document into AI has just breached copyright, but they've basically devalued the intellectual property that was connected to that writing. And that's a pretty significant concern for the standards bodies, who have invested their business models into being able to collect their revenue for being able to license standards. So at the end of the month, there is a meeting where there will be a significant conversation between these standards bodies about what is a revenue model that allows them to be able to have open standards, as Dale Christie mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, where I played a piece of his video. That open set of standards is a barrier if it costs money, and is a highway if it is something that is made freely available to the small providers as well as to the large providers in the industry. And having a solution that simplifies the movements of goods down to identifiers and statuses and communication of those statuses between stakeholders, we believe is the starting point of being able to create that level of trust and interconnectivity between the stakeholders that are transacting business in an open marketplace, as well as providing a more structured infrastructure of data collected on historical transactions by normalizing those transactions for analysis. Next slide. So just kind of a awareness of what's taking place in the regulation side of things. I mentioned before the Genius Act and the Clarity Act. The Genius Act became law last year. Clarity Act is being highly lobbied for at the moment. There is a funding bill that this may get tucked into. There is a criminal view called CORCA that is also a bipartisan bill to combat organized crime that also plays into these digital identifiers and interconnectivity and intercommunication between the stakeholders. as the things can't be done through law, there has been a significant number of executive orders that have also related to AI and to the adoption of technology that are ones to be able to watch. And in the transportation sector specifically, we have a area that I'm looking for still from the Federal Transportation, or excuse me, the Federal Maritime Commission, where they had Article or Section 4 of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act suggested that there was to be a registry for shipping exchanges, which is that identifier of who is the party who is in the middle between a shipper and the ship lines that move the numerous steps, that those middlemen, there isn't currently a directory or a registry that maintains the accountability or authenticity of those trusted agencies to be able to engage in those financial transactions. So that was due in June of 2025. It's a little bit late at the moment, but we're still anxiously waiting for it to be able to come. And the FMC has recently gotten to the point that they have a full house of 5 commissioners that are now there, so they should be able to pick up on some of that work. Next slide, please. Governance is key. Governance is key kind of comes from our blockchain space. I started working in blockchain back in the 2018, 2017 timeframe, and there was a lot of discussion around who should own a blockchain, who should own the infrastructure, who should be the stakeholders, and how does that governance get established to be able to have longevity. And there was a paper written by Ansel and Gash that was cited by Dr. Denise McCurdy, who worked for us for a period of time to be able to help establish the initial governance within DFM Data Corp, that prescribed a neutrality, described a difficulty in being able to have industry stakeholders really take the sole leadership of those infrastructure plays, because ultimately they have shareholders that they need to answer to. And having the open source, this is a good idea, let's all work together at the very beginning, sounds like a really good idea. It's actually the way that AI started with all of the main players also. And then it kind of changes into, well, somebody's going to go make money on it. So if we did all the work on the front end, shouldn't we get some of the rewards for it? And those ethics that we brought up at the beginning kind of get in the way of what the initial outcomes were. Governance is the thing that keeps that in check. Governance is the thing that is the bylaws of the organization. It's the who's supposed to be able to run this and keep a clear head about how much money it's making, how much money it's providing, how much value it's providing, how much value it's taking, and to be able to balance those between the stakeholders that are involved in governance. I, as the CEO of DFM Data Corp, do not ship any loads. I do not own any trucks. I do not own any capacity or any transaction marketplaces. The intention, the piece that I felt that I could bring value to this marketplace was to help bring that neutral governance technology. This infrastructure for the trucking industry has typically worked on that piece of paper that's traveling and moving with those goods. For that to move digitally through the supply chain, somebody who doesn't have an axe to grind in that has to be responsible for being able to move that. So my journey in this space started back with the patents back in 2003, 2004, to be able to look at this digital combining of this transaction space. But it's now matured to the point that fraud has really infested itself throughout the entire ecosystem. And without digital controls, without a governance, it's a problem that I don't think we'll be able to unscramble. We won't be able to put this egg back inside the shell. Humpty Dumpty has fallen off of the wall. We have problems that we need to fix, and they're related to digital identifiers. Next slide, please. So that's me and my contact information. DFM Data Corp, you'll notice right underneath it has an IBRN, that is an International Business Registry number. It is maybe the most useful registry number that exists. It actually contains your corporate identity number, your control number. It contains the name as is your legal name in the legal registry, as well as the formation date of your company. It is the who you are. It is also standard ISO 8000-116. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.